Hi, my name is Dasna Nyaga and my section number is 32Q01.
Hi, my name is Shelly Mendoza and my section number is 32Q02. So today I'm be interviewing Dasne, and the first question is: in Booker T. Washington's The Atlanta Compromise, he states, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress." This reflects his stance on segregation. How do you think this quote reflects his vision on race relations?
And so, basically, the quote illustrates his vision. She's basically saying that African Americans want to, stay socially segregated when it comes to, social affairs, but want to become integrated when it comes, to business affairs. So he basically uses, a metaphor of a hand, so they want to be as separate as fingers when it comes to, being interacting socially or being in their community, such as the laws and stuff, something that will actually influence their society, but they want to be as strong as a hand when it comes to economic progress. And he's basically saying that African Americans and white people should work together when it comes to progressing for an economic stand view, but he still wants to be segregated in some form. And it basically illustrates that he does accept segregation and that he believes in economic independence for African Americans.
Yeah, I think he was, kind of like what you said. He was basically saying, we don't have to be friends,
Yeah.
You don't have to invite me to your party, so I don't have to invite you. But, if they can put aside their differences,
Yeah.
they can still thrive. They can benefit each other in a way.
Yeah.
So I think, it's a good response.
Like your corporation, they're still working together. Like the example he said in his writing was cast on your back buckets wherever you are. So stuff like that.
Okay, and the next question is: how did Washington's position differ from that of other African American leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois in terms of strategies for achieving racial equality?
Well, like I said before, Washington, what set him apart was that he really believed in economic independence, and he was very accommodating. He did accept segregation, and he believed in gradualism, that African Americans should start from the bottom and then go to the top by doing small jobs and then gaining the skills that will help them progress later on. He believed by African Americans working small jobs, they'll eventually gain the skill assets, and then they'll become politicians and other stuff like that. He really believed that eventually African Americans will get to a point in society where they are respected. And yeah, and what also set him apart from W. Du Bois and other intellectuals is that he did not believe in resistance. He didn't want to push back on white people because he believed that it would just lead to more backlash and setbacks, that they weren't prepared in the moment to directly want reform or political liberties or civil liberties. And he really believed in vocational training over higher education. Du Bois was very highly educated at a prestigious university, while Washington believed more on hands-on jobs and skills like that. So that really set him apart from other intellectuals.
I think the fact that he was born a slave too, he knew firsthand
Yeah.
what it was to go through that. I think he was just very careful about his approach because he didn't want him or other African Americans to go back to that, because he knew what it was like to go through that. He didn't want that to happen again. So I think he did take a more
accommodating approach.
They say it was accommodating. I think he was just being a little logical for a time.
Yeah.
He knew that change wasn't gonna be instant, and he didn't want to lose what they had already gained.
Mm-hmm.
And I think W.B. Du Bois, he was different because he was more, I don't know, he wanted it
immediate.
Yeah. He wanted them to kind of thing. He said that he wanted had to take what they want, basically, in a way. So I think they were really different in that way.
Yes, it's Washington became more a gradualistic approach, while Du Bois wanted immediate reform.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I think for a time it was just
very not the best
Yeah.
course of action. Maybe later on, but
yeah. Okay, what were some of the criticisms that Booker T. Washington faced?
well, like we said, many people criticized Washington to be very passive and accommodating. They were basically saying that he wasn't doing enough, that he was just giving into the prejudice that white people were giving him, and that he didn't want to gain civil liberties, and that he wasn't doing his best. But for a time period, I do believe that he was doing his best because they were not capable of doing everything Du Bois wanted directly and immediately. And he also came under fire because, like we said, he didn't believe in higher education. He wanted more vocational training. So many did criticize him, and they were basically saying that he wasn't doing enough for the fight for social equality, and that he would prefer wealth accumulation rather than social equality.
Yeah, I think they were like quick to say he was like a sellout.
Yeah,
to
he
the
was
white
a sellout.
people.
Yeah.
Especially after the Atlanta Compromise speech. I think after that, like he faced a lot of criticism. People didn't really like too much of what he had to say. That he was, like you said, accommodating to the white people, and he didn't want African Americans to get their rights back. He wasn't doing enough. I think he did do like behind closed doors. He would try to help in whatever way he could.
Yeah.
But yeah. And how should Washington's legacy be interpreted in light of both his accomplishments and criticisms?
Well, we said, he was born a slave and he accomplished a lot. He was the first prominent black intellectual during this period in the Reconstruction era. So, that was a big accomplishment, and he achieved a high level in the political world. And he established a law, even though he was highly criticized. He even established like a vocational institute, and although he was highly criticized, those comments led him to build the foundation for other intellectuals like Du Bois. So Du Bois saw his ideas, and he built off on that. And he was like, okay, so Washington believed in this, but I believe in that, but I'm gonna add on to it and why Washington was wrong. So he basically led the path for other intellectuals such as Du Bois and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, I think even though he was criticized by a lot for his opinions or how he wanted to approach gaining equality, I think he still did set the path for them to follow. They might not agree and they made their own adjustments, but I think he was the settings, he started it all and people just went off of it for years to come.
Yeah, it's the domino effect. He led the concrete for
So after reading the Atlanta Compromise, The Souls of Black Folk excerpt, and Booker T. Washington versus W.E.B. Du Bois, The Great Debate, who do you think had the most reasonable approach?
I think Washington had the most reasonable approach because at the time it was very unrealistic for them to gain immediate action or immediate reform, especially I just think Washington was playing it safe because as one of the readings we read in class, it said that he didn't believe if African Americans and white people were in a race war that African Americans would be victorious, that they would lose because one, they did not have the resource for it and they weren't equipped for it, and white people still didn't view African Americans as citizens, so it wouldn't have gone their way. And if African Americans would have pushed for rights, it would just cause backlash, like we said. White people were gonna feel threatened and they want to take away the 13th Amendment and stuff like that. And at this time, even if they did do reforms, civil reforms, they were taken away by Jim Crow laws and stuff like that. So I think Washington had the best approach because it was more realistic, and I do believe that people should start from the bottom and then go top, because if you start from the top, you don't really know how it feels to be in the bottom, with skill sets and stuff, because a lot of in this period, a lot of states did not know how to read and write, so they couldn't really be politicians right away because they still had to gain the assets to be a politician, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, like I said, for the time, Washington, I think he was more realistic about it. And he, like I said, he was a slave, so he knew what it was.
Yeah, he knew how it was.
Yeah, he knew what it was like, and he didn't want to go back to that. He knew, that if they were to get in a race war, like he said, they lost, it would be worse to go back to that,
worse.
Because at least, even though they don't have everything they wanted right now, they were still fighting for it. It was better than what they had before.
Yeah.
So I do think he had the most realistic approach. W.B. Du Bois, I think he wanted like the same. They both wanted the same thing.
Yeah, they were both heading for the same goal.
Yeah,
but
they had the same goal and different approaches. His wasn't a bad approach.
Yeah.
I just think for that time they needed to like gradually
Yeah.
they could build themselves up so that way they wouldn't have to be too accommodating to the white people
Yeah.
and their feelings and not threaten them.
Yeah, because now Du Bois will be a more realistic approach, but back then it was Washington.
Yeah.
And I also like to add on to what you said that like Washington, he had the experience of being a slave, while Du Bois, he didn't. He grew up in like a middle class family, so he truly didn't know exactly what it felt like to be a slave. So he didn't really have like the best viewpoint, if that makes sense. Yeah.
He wasn't there like firsthand. People like
Yeah.
wanted him to go on further his education, and
Yeah,
that
he
was
went to
good
Harvard,
for him.
and like
Yeah.
he had the resources to go to
Like that was good for
university.
him,
Yeah.
but like at the same time, he didn't like really go through
Yeah.
what Washington went through, so he could I think Washington was more fearful. You know, he didn't want to go back to that. Du Bois didn't really know what it was like too much, so that's why he probably wasn't thinking like that.
Yeah. He wasn't trying to like play it safe, basically.
Okay, and that concludes this interview.
So today I'm going to be interviewing Shailyn, and the first question is based on the text Booker T. Washington versus W.E.B. Du Bois, the Great Debate. How did Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois differ in the manner in which they wanted to achieve social equality?
So, based on the text, I think Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, they both had fundamentally different approaches on how to achieve social equality for African Americans during the late 19th century. Booker T. Washington, he advocated more for a gradualist approach. He believed that Black people should focus more on economic self-sufficiency, vocational education, and industrial skills rather than seeking immediate social and political equality. In his famous speech, The Atlantic Compromise, he suggested to African Americans that they should just temporarily accept segregation for that time being, while proving their economic value to society. He wanted them to emphasize hard work, self-help, and accommodation to white society as a way to eventually gain their civil rights. W.E.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, I think he very much rejected Washington's gradualist approach, and he argued for immediate and full civil rights. He believed that African Americans should pursue higher education, intellectual development, and political activism to challenge racial discrimination.
Yes, I want to add on to that. So, like, you basically believe that Washington, he did believe that African Americans should sacrifice like certain things like voting rights, and like they should kind of like accommodate to white people's prejudice, because eventually over time, as they build like their skill sets, they will gradually attain a place in society that they've been wanting to. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. And like Du Bois differed because he didn't want to go through that process. He just wanted to go immediately to change.
He thought that like they should immediately get their rights, and that they already proved.
Yeah, they already
proved.
Basically. Yeah.
They shouldn't have to keep fighting for this.
Yeah. That shouldn't have make more sacrifice to white people, and that they should just immediately change.
Like Du Bois, he like even suggested the talented 10.
Yeah.
Like a belief that small educated elite of African Americans should lead the fight for racial justice, and I think that was something that was very different from Washington. Like Washington thought like everybody, all African Americans, they should be able to have economic independence before, and he wanted them, a small group basically, to fight for them. Du Bois.
Well, like Washington compared to Du Bois, he believed on like hands-on learning, like to go to an institute where they actually can learn like trade skills rather than going to like Harvard or like a university to learn other things, The next question is, based on the Atlantic Compromise speech and the Social Black Vote by Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, how did these two prominent Black intellectuals influence and lead the path for the modern civil rights movement?
So I think although they had contrasting views as expressed in Washington's Atlantic Compromise speech and Du Bois's book, they still shaped the approaches that were later adopted by civil rights leaders in the 20th century. In his speech, Washington argues that African Americans should accept segregation for the time being and focus instead on economic self-improvement through vocational education and hard work. He believed that by proving their economic value to society, African Americans would gradually earn respect and eventually civil rights. His philosophy of self-help and accommodation influenced early 20th century leaders who promoted economic empowerment, including later figures like Marcus Garvey and the Black economic self-sufficiency movements. I think, on the other hand, Du Bois, in his book *The Souls of Black Folk*, he openly criticizes Washington's approach and argues that African Americans should demand immediate civil rights, political participation, and higher education. Du Bois' ideas, like the talented tint that he introduced, later inspired the NAACP, which eventually became a driving force behind legal battles against segregation, including cases like Brown versus the Board of Education.
So, like, Du Bois in Washington really did lay the groundwork, as Du Bois created the institution that led to further legislation that led to like more civil rights and stuff like that. And I believe that they really inspired Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, as they had similar ideologies such as resistance that's similar to Du Bois and Malcolm X. And then Martin Luther King and Washington, they were more susceptible to being accommodating and like not being participants of violence and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think, ultimately, while Washington and Du Bois, they had like different tactics and argued, they still shaped overall the path to their civil rights for Black African Americans.
Yes, they really laid the work down.
Yeah.
How did Walt Whitman's writing in The Lone Dresser vary from other female poets of this day, and how do you think his work affected writing at the time?
Walt Whitman's The Lone Dresser, I think it stands out from poetry of other male poets during this time due to like its raw first-hand depiction of the horrors of war and its deep human compassion. Like a lot of poets during the 19th century, they often glorified war, heroism, and national pride, but Whitman took a different approach, and he offered a stark, unfiltered look at the suffering of wounded soldiers during the Civil War. I think other poets, he was like unlike other poets who wrote about war from a distant, idealized perspective. Whitman's The Lone Dresser is based off his real life experience as a volunteer nurse, and he does not focus on battlefield heroics, but rather on the pain, suffering, and humanity of the wounded soldiers.
Yeah, I would like to add on to that like Waldman really changed the poetry of this time because he introduced soft writing. Like, it was very rare for like male poets to talk about other men in the way he did. He was very like soft spoken, and like he showed that he cared a lot about the soldiers. And it was very controversial during this time for male poets to this, but he actually opened that pathway in American literature, because in European literature it was already occurring, but it was new, and he inspired the movement in American literature.
Yeah, his poetry, it emphasized empathy over glorification, which was radical for the time too. And I think his poetry carried a deeply democratic and humanistic spirit. He did not distinguish between Union and Confederate soldiers. Instead, he focused on their shared suffering. He didn't it wasn't too focused on politics, which is what other male poets usually wrote about this time. He focused more on empathy and more romantic undertones.
Yeah, like a more romantic side. Because usually poetry, like war poetry, then the time was something like the victories to the battles, but he really focused on the soldiers and created a sense of empathy and a romantic stance of the war, basically. According to Alice Faye's article, The Sentimental Soldier in Popular Civil War Literature during this era placed a strong emphasis on empathy by emphasizing the individual above the masses. How did it affect the perception of the war at this time among non-soldiers, in your opinion?
So I think Alice's article, it highlights how literature during the Civil War era placed a strong emphasis on empathy by portraying individual soldiers' suffering rather than glorifying large-scale battles. This literary approach had a profound impact on how non-soldiers, especially civilians on the home front, perceived the war. By focusing more on personal experiences rather than grand military strategies, sentimental literature made soldiers relatable figures rather than distant heroes. Readers, especially women and families waiting at home for their loved ones that were at the war, they were encouraged to see soldiers as sons, brothers, and husbands enduring pain and loss rather than some random faceless warrior. I think this deepened their emotional connection to the war. You know, unlike traditional war narratives that glorified battlefield victories, sentimental literature highlighted the emotional and physical toll that war took. There was wounds, death, separation, and grief. And yeah, I think that this softened the nationalistic fever often associated with war and made civilians more aware of the true cost of conflict.
Yes, I wanted to add on to that. I really think the war literature during this period, like the sentimental version of it, I think it made a lot of non-soldiers really view the war in a different way. I do think because they felt more connected to the war, it did cause some level of patriotism in there because they felt really connected to the soldiers in the form. They still felt bad, but they were like, oh no, their loss is still being counted in a sort of way, if that makes sense. They were still building a sense of patriotism. So the war really, like, the poetry really made the war seem a different way than it was beforehand.
I think it also, like, this sentimental writing, I think it also encouraged more people at home to aid the war.
Yeah,
like they
to
would
support it.
yeah they would do fundraising and volunteering as nurses and stuff because they feel more connected
Yeah.
to these stories and they wanted to help.
Based on the poem, I Felt a Funeral in My Brain by Emily Dickinson, how did Dickinson structure her poem to showcase her inner turmoil?
I think Emily Dickinson, in her poem, she uses vivid imagery, rhythm, and unconventional structure to convey the inner turmoil and psychological distress. Through the metaphor of a funeral, she explores themes of mental anguish, isolation, and the breakdown of rational thoughts. She uses the funeral as a metaphor for her mental descent. I think the progression of the funeral events, like the mourners gathering, the services, and then people carrying the coffin, and even the burial, I think that mirrors a gradual loss of sanity that was happening to her or in her head, and even an overwhelming emotional collapse. Dickinson frequently uses dashes to disrupt the flow of the poem, and I think that was to create a sense of like disjointed thoughts, like she couldn't think clearly, or even instability. And the erratic pacing reflects a fractured mind struggling to process reality. And I think the speaker says the speaker experiences the funeral in a highly sensory way too. You know, the intense focus on sensory details highlights how internal suffering feels both overwhelming and isolating at the same time, like as if the speaker is trapped in her own mind.
Yes, I would add on, like, Emily Dickinson, she was very creative in how she created this poem because she structured it in a way as like a Christian funeral. Like it went from one stage of funeral to the next to the next, and it showed like the mental process of her that she was like facing like such a inner conflict, within herself. Like the metaphor she used, like she used a lot of similes too, and like the way she even like wrote it. And she's known for how she writes it and how it really represents what she's feeling. And
yeah, I think the poem, like overall, it doesn't offer a resolution, but rather immerses the reader in the experience of unraveling thoughts, making her inner turmoil palpable and deeply unsettling.
And like during this time, this is how she expressed how she was feeling about the war. It was the way she was showing her expression because she couldn't really say it out loud, so she wrote it in a form. So this concludes our interview. Thank you.